So I just discovered Authortube, like literally, like last night. I was just snooping around. I've been on YouTube for just about 3 months now, where I do like a weekly poetry reading and I talk about the poems from my books. And we're going to be joined by Clover here. And I was beginning to feel a little bit defeated. I was beginning to feel like a little bit like YouTube is so saturated, and maybe this isn't a good outlet for me to come on and talk about my poems. Maybe there's not really a good poetry market out there. And so I just started sniffing around and started to look for different author type related content. And I was led to Authortube. So I'm very happy to be here. And I will introduce myself in just a moment. But I just wanted to say that I see a lot of people are doing a meet the author type of video. And so I figured, like I mentioned, I've been on YouTube, pardon me, for about 3 months now, coming up on 3 months, and just kind of plugging along there. So I thought maybe this might be a good opportunity to introduce myself, talk a little bit about my books, and hopefully we can connect via Authortube. I would love that so much. So this is Clover. She's one of my kitties, and she likes to make her appearance in videos. So about me, and now that you met Clover, my name is K.A. Block. My real name is Kristen, and I am the author and poet of 4 self-published books. And at some point, I do plan to do a video about my self-publishing journey. But for now, I don't really have that much to offer other than some experience, like what I paid the publishers, a little bit about royalties, and some lessons that I've learned going through that process. So at some point, I will do a future video on that experience. But in the meantime, if you have any questions about self-publishing, my 2 that I used were Balboa Press and Gatekeeper Press. So if you have any questions on either of those in the meantime, feel free to comment or reach out to me via social media or etc. And I'll be happy to answer those questions until I can find the time to do a video about self-publishing. So again, my name is K.A. Block, and my channel is called The Practical Poet. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, where that name came from. But in the meantime, this is a Meet the Author. So I thought I would give a little bit about my history, how I started to write poetry, and what led me into self-publishing 4 books. So I began writing when I was very young, like 4 or 5 years old. When I could pick up a pencil was when I started to write, and I would start off writing little short stories and things that would, my parents and family friends would kind of just like laugh at and keep me entertained. And one of the reasons that I started to write a lot was because I was the youngest in my family, not a big family, but and not very loud either. But for some reason, they always interrupted me when I would speak. I would be in the middle of a story, and somebody would come along and just interrupt me, and my story was forgotten. So I learned, though, at a very young age, that if I wrote something down and I said, hey, family, or hey, mom and dad, I have something to read to you, then they would find the time to listen to what I had written down. And so I started to learn that was able to get attention that way. I was able to kind of have their undivided attention. Shortly after that, the short stories just started to rhyme, and I would just start rhyming words together and come up with a little story, and that was just my style. When I was about 10 years old, I wrote a poem called Chitter, and Chitter made its way into my first book here called Walk Through a Field of Flowers, which I'll talk about in a minute. Chitter was the story of a mischievous little mouse. And this little mouse always wanted to get the attention of the family cat, who was a little bit older, a little bit lazy. This was before I had cats, when I thought that they just kind of laid around all day and didn't really have personalities. Truth be told, between you and me, I have 5 cats right now, and I actually have 6 that have crossed over to the Rainbow Bridge. So clearly, I have learned that cats are the best thing ever, right? But anyway, I digress. So in my 10-year-old brain, cat was very lazy and didn't really want to be bothered by this mouse. And this mouse was so cute and just wanted to play. Well, the funny thing about Chitter was Chitter had a very tragic ending. Chitter did not end well. And please, I would never harm an animal. I mean, I swore for squirrels. So this was written with the innocence of a 10-year-old. I would never do any harm. I'm not like celebrating what happened to Chitter. It probably should have been sent for therapy after this poem was written. I don't know what my brain was thinking, but it rhymed and it flowed together. And when I read it to my parents, they started, they were listening. It was after dinner. We were sitting downstairs in our family room, and I remember reading it to them, and they politely were listening and nodding along and smiling as parents do when a 10-year-old is reciting something. And then when I got to Chitter's demise, my dad's eyes like lit up like saucers, and he was like, what? And he literally burst out laughing because he just did not expect that kind of an ending for poor little Chitter. And I remember going to bed a little while later, and he was still laughing about Chitter. He still couldn't believe that I had written about Chitter. So again, you can read that. Maybe one day I'll do a little video poetry reading about Chitter. But after that, every time somebody came over to the house, I had to read Chitter to them. And, like I said, they probably should have sent me for some therapy, but it got a lot of laughs. And I learned at a very, very young age then that what I wrote down or my words could have an impact on people. And that carried through into my teenage years. I started writing maybe a little bit more deeper. You start to get into that teenage puberty, young romantic age where I probably wrote a few love poems. And, I would always get the attention of people. They would always want to sit and listen to what I had written down. And so again, I learned that words had an impact, and that by me reading my words, got a nice reaction. So I kept up with it. In my early 20s, my dad passed away very suddenly. And so my poems got a little bit deeper after that. I wrote a poem called His Garage, which again also appears in my young poems. My very early poems are all in my first book called Walk Through a Field of Flowers. And so his poem was His Garage, and it was about his little man cave and all of the projects and stuff that he left behind that would never get done. And that became a family favorite. And then shortly after that, I did a poem called So Long for Now, which is where I would kind of look up into the night sky and feel his guidance a little bit, or even the guidance of other relatives that had passed away, that little guiding light, that the little guiding hand that we feel from time to time. So those started to get a little bit deeper. And then into my early 20s, I didn't really write much. I kind of, was busy with school and work and romance and trying to build a 20-year-old life, partying, stuff like that. And I didn't even really tell anybody that I had written poetry. People that I just met, I didn't really divulge that. It was kind of like a secret. I was maybe a little bit embarrassed to say that, oh, I write poetry. It seemed like kind of a geeky thing to do. So I really kept it hidden. And then didn't really write much or anything. And then 2020 happened. And if you remember, which who could forget, right? COVID, the lockdown, and we were all, looking for things to do within our homes. So I started cleaning out a drawer one day in my front hall closet, and I found my binder of my very young poems. And I started going through them, and I started thinking, some of these aren't half bad. Like, maybe I should put these out into the world. I'm going to be gone someday. And wouldn't it be nice for the world to know that I had done something, that I had contributed something? So I started looking into self-publishing, and I was led to Balboa Press, which did a very nice job for me. I can't really complain too much about them. The only thing would be like their royalty structure. I don't think is the best out there. They do, they charge you. It's a hybrid publisher, so you pay them some money to publish, and then they also collect some of the royalties too, which I'm not super thrilled about that. But I don't want to get into a whole self-publishing segment here, so I'll save that for another video. But what happened with Balboa Press was I started to submit my manuscript. I started working with them, and I found out that I needed 50 pages worth of content, and I was a little shy of that amount. So I started to, double space, make my font bigger, trying to get to that 50 pages, and it just wasn't happening. And I was disappointed because I really wanted to publish. I started then going back to my poems, and I started telling a little story about each one of them. Not a story like a made-up story, but like an inspiration. Like, how did I come up with this poem? Like for Chitter, about how I was a 10-year-old and where that came from, or his garage and how that was my dad's man cave. And I started telling a little bit about the inspiration before the poem, and then I got into the reading of the poem. And my plan for that was never to take away the reader's experience. Like, I never want to dictate to anybody what my poems are about. I want everybody to be able to find their own meaning or their own interpretation of my poems. But this was my story of how the poem came to be. And sure enough, I had my 50 pages and was able to publish and give the book to my family at Christmas time. And my sister just cried and made a big fuss over it. She was super happy about it. But one of the points of feedback that I got from people was, first of all, they were really happy to see my young poems in print, but they really, really loved the story that I told before the poem. They really loved hearing the backstory. They really liked hearing, what inspired me to write the poem. A little while later, I just got a little bug in my brain and I started writing and writing and writing again. And that became my second book called Scatter Seeds of Kindness. This was also initially published through Balboa Press. Once I got frustrated with their royalty structure, I tried to republish with another publisher called Good River. Bad River, another story for that. But I ended up pulling the plug on them after I spent about $1,500 to $2,000 trying to republish with them. And I was finally led over to Gatekeeper, who is love them to death. They're expensive. You kind of get what you pay for with them, but very happy with them and their work. And they ended up ultimately republishing Scatter Seeds of Kindness. But I followed the same format that I did with my first book of telling the little story, the little inspiration before each poem. How did it come to be? And sometimes it wasn't even how it came to be. Sometimes it was just my random thoughts. It was just like, hey, I just had this thought and these are my thoughts on it. And kind of did a little bit of a story or inspiration before the poem. And again, like with my first book, many people told me that they loved that part of the book. Like that was their favorite, just kind of reading my thought process, how I came up with the poem, maybe what I was thinking when I wrote it. And it was interesting to see in some cases if they agreed with my thoughts or if they disagreed. So shortly after that, again, the writing spurt continued, and I came out with my third book called Gather Seeds of Hope. A little bit thicker, a little more storytelling on my part before I got into the poem itself, and a lot of words, a lot of stories on this one, a lot of poems here. And again, like with my first two books, really people were really digging the little backstory, if you will. I'm just going to go ahead and call it that, like the backstory before the poem. And again, interesting to see if we agreed on that. And then most recently, this past year, I came out with my fourth book called Sow Seeds of Wisdom. And this just came out in spring of 2024. And so following that same format. So it was interesting journey for me to realize that friends and family weren't exactly rushing out to buy my books or to read them. A lot of them just waited for me to give them away to them because I would buy, a box full and then I would sign them and I would hand them away. And a lot of people just didn't really make an effort to buy. So it's not like I've been selling a ton of books. I realized earlier last year that I needed a different method to sell my books or to market my books, if you will. And that's when I decided to create my blog. And my blog is called The Practical Poet. And the reason I went with that name was because so many people have told me that, poetry can be difficult. Think back to like your high school poetry when we had to dissect a poem, or going back to like Shakespeare or even Emily Dickinson, some of the classics can be a little bit intimidating and a little bit hard to understand sometimes. And I have had people tell me that, my poetry is very relatable. They understand it in a way that maybe they never understood poetry before. They're embracing it in a way that they maybe have never embraced poetry before. And that just kind of warms my heart. In fact, I have a quote here that I wrote down. I had a friend of a friend who knew an accountant, a 60-year-old man who was his accountant. And my friend called me up one night and he says, "Hey, I'm sitting here with my accountant and he's got to talk to you about something." And I'm like, "What could your accountant possibly have to talk to me about?" Right. So he puts the accountant on the phone and the accountant says, "Kristen," he says, "I'm a 60-year-old accountant." And he says, I don't read much poetry. And he's like, "In fact, I don't read any poetry." He says, "But I read your book." And at the time it was Scatter Seeds of Kindness. He says, "I read your book and I absolutely loved it." And he's like, "I am now a fan of poetry." So I've heard that time and again from people, just saying, they can relate. They know exactly what I'm talking about. They shake their heads in agreement, not always, but in a lot of cases, shake their head in agreement. And if they're not exactly sure what the poem is about, they like to read my backstory. And like I mentioned, we don't always agree. They may say, well, I kind of think of it differently, or I kind of thought about the poem this way. I never want to take that away from the reader. I always want the reader to be able to interpret the poem in their own way. I'm just kind of letting you know my thoughts when I wrote it. So I wanted to call my channel and my blog The Relatable Poet, but I kind of struggle with spelling the word relatable, to be honest with you. I'm never sure if we keep that E before we get into able or not. So I thought, well, if I struggle with that, other people may as well. And I just decided that the practical poet was, more practical. So my blog was born earlier this year, where I do a weekly blog post where I put a poem out there along with the backstory. And then I post that. And then I always wanted to get into a video poetry reading, like a poetry corner, if you will. And I finally got up the courage after watching like 1,500 videos saying just hit record. I started to do my poetry readings and talking about the backstory. And those can all be found on my channel at The Practical Poet. But like I mentioned, kind of just chugging along there. I'm not sure there's a huge market out there for poetry readings on YouTube. So was getting a little bit discouraged, and finally, just like yesterday, sitting in the hair salon getting my hair colored, and just started snooping around on YouTube, and found this great thing called Authortube. So I'm very excited to be here. I thank you for listening to my story. I'm hoping that we can connect, on other things book related. Again, I hope to do a self-publishing video shortly, and each week I do the weekly poetry reading, and then like I mentioned, talk about the poem, talk a little bit about the backstory, and then I post that, along in YouTube and on my blog as well. So I just want to do a quick thing here, see if there was anything that I forgot that I wanted to mention. I already mentioned I'm a huge cat lover. I am a part-time Pilates instructor. I work full time and then do that on the side, and then have this little writing gig as well. So pretty busy. I have an MBA, and I work full time, and just a lover of kitties and wine, and a Jeep. I have a really cool Jeep, so those are some fun things as well. So I hope that you will check out my channel. I hope to check out yours. So please post in the comments if you have a writer's channel or an author's channel, or something that I can help support you on. Again, I'm finding YouTube to be a very saturated market and not a lot of place for poetry readings or readings in general, anything writing related. So I'm super happy to be here. Again, my name is K.A. Block, first name Kristen, channel is The Practical Poet, blog of the same name. And I thank you so much for listening. It was wonderful to meet you. I hope we can chat again real soon on somewhere YouTube related, or just out in the social media arena. And I wish you well on your writing journey, and hopefully we'll chat soon. Thanks. Bye.